Hello, everyone, and welcome to this week's podcast. I'm Clay Jenkinson. So I'm having the time of my life out here, but Beau and I have been talking for a long time about constitutions, and he's one of the few people who agrees with me that Jefferson was right when he said we need to tear up the Constitution every 19 years or so that we have fresh ideas and we're not prevented from important change by the straitjacket of the past. He famously said we may as well require a man to wear the coat that fitted him as a child as to require our civilized citizens to live under the order of barbarism from the past. And I agree with that. We need to tear up the Constitution and start over. And Beau and his prize student, Prairie Gunnels, came up with by using AI, ChatGPT, is that there are 7 generations in this society now, beginning with the greatest generation and ending with Alpha, the brand new generation, and that they together in class, not just Prairie, but others in her class with their instructor, their professor, Beau Breslin, created a new constitution for each of the 7 generations, or by each of the 7 generations, using ChatGPT. And this is Beau's way of coming to terms with AI rather than simply forbidding it. Remember, if you're old enough when pocket calculators were forbidden in math classes or physics classes, today that's just a ludicrous notion. And so technology has a way of making us come to terms with it, whether we like it or not. And so it's a really ingenious thing, and I'm very much looking forward to seeing the results of what they have done in creating 7 new constitutions with 7 new preambles, and seeing how each generation would configure the country a little bit differently for its own aspirations and its own sense of what's at stake. That kind of process is the best gift we could give to the United States as it approaches its 250th birthday next July 4th, that our Constitution, in my opinion, is broken. Number 2, our Constitution is helplessly broken. In other words, I don't think it can be fixed. Number 3, there are flaws in the Constitution, and not just by who was represented in 1787. It was all white males, of course, many of them slaveholders. But it's also inefficient at getting at the issues of our time. So anyway, Beau Breslin, a frequent guest, Skidmore College, and one of his prize students, Prairie Gunnels, who is in Italy today. We are managed, thanks to Zoom technology, to come together. Just a couple quick more things. You can still sign up for the Steinbeck retreat in September 21st through 29th in Salinas and Monterey. I hope you will. It's going to be fabulous. You can also sign up for the book club. It's not too late. Tonight, for example, the question I'm going to ask to start with, they've all read this book, Lewis and Clark Day by Day by Gary Moulton. The question I'm going to ask is, what's the place of the Lewis and Clark story in American history? Why are we talking about it? Of course, it's fascinating, but what does it help us understand about the dynamics of American history? Please join our friends group. It's really important to be able to fund all of this. I'm going to take a shower now in my Airstream shower. I got it fixed yesterday. It's been on the fritz. You know the rule. If you're going to fix something, you have to go to Home Depot at least 3 and maybe 4 times. The 3rd time was the charm. My shower now delivers hot water and doesn't leak anymore. It needs a few more tweaks, but I'm very proud of myself of having handled this little infrastructural problem myself, thanks to YouTube, which has wonderful videos showing you step by step how to repair the shower in an Airstream trailer. So it's an amazing journey out here, and I'm so glad that you're part of it. And please continue listening and join at the highest level that you can. Consider coming on the Steinbeck tour. We have our winter encampments coming up in January, and next year's Lewis and Clark. And we're going to France beginning next fall, and you really want to consider coming to France when the nation is celebrating its 250th birthday, because France played an essential role in the United States surviving English colonialization. So let's go to the show. Hello, everyone, and welcome to this special edition of Listening to America. I'm Clay Jenkinson, and I have an old friend back for this podcast, my friend Beau Breslin of Skidmore. Beau, you and I have had many conversations together, and particularly about one of the more arcane or controversial areas in Jefferson's thought. When Madison and the others were creating the Constitution of the United States in Philadelphia in the summer of 1787, Jefferson was in France. He was watching all this with some eagerness and some concern about what they would produce. When he finally received copies from George Washington and Ben Franklin and James Madison at the end of the summer, he was a little disappointed with what they had done, and he actually said maybe Madison should go back and have a second constitutional convention and get it right that time. But he also wrote in France a series of what might be called radical letters to Madison about the nature of civilization. And in one of them he said, "The earth belongs to the living, not the dead, and therefore a constitution really can't be a perpetual instrument. In some sense it should sunset with the death of the generation that created it, and the rising generation should create a new constitution based on its needs and its ambitions and aspirations. And if we did this about once every 19 years or so, we would not only be a real republic, but we would be able to accommodate the changes in technology and social structure and demographics that are inevitable in any dynamic culture." Beau, is that a fair read?
Yeah, that's perfect. And it's funny because you and I have been talking about this more or less on and off for 4 or 5 years. And when we originally talked about this, I was a total Madisonian, and now I'm a Jeffersonian. I actually think we need to rip the Constitution up and start again.
I'm gonna claim that I've converted you. I'm sure that's not true, but I'm gonna claim it because why not? We're joined today by one of your prize students, Prairie Gunnels, who's actually in Italy today. So, Beau, you're in the East Coast. I'm in Helena, Montana, and Prairie is in Italy. Thank you, Zoom technology. And the two of you, Beau, worked on a project together. Quickly describe that and pass it on to Prairie.
Yeah, so it's inspired by Jefferson's idea that each generation ought to write its own constitution, Clay. For Jefferson, he understood constitution makers as being people like him, older white folks. But you can slice that Jefferson's argument differently and think about what each living generation how their constitution would look. And so what Prairie and I have done over the last many months is she took artificial intelligence, ChatGPT, and I'll ask her to explain it in a second, and she generated constitutions that reflect the interests and passions and priorities of each of the living generations. And there are currently, Clay, 7 living generations: the greatest generation, the silent generation, baby boomers, Gen X, millennials, Gen Z, and the youngest is the alpha generation. And so what Prairie did was she asked ChatGPT to generate constitutions that reflect that. And what our project is comparing what those constitutions would look like if each generation was responsible for writing the constitutional document.
First of all, I'm flabbergasted that there are 7 living generations. I think Jefferson would be flabbergasted too. Right. I thought the boomers were the ancient ones, but apparently we're not. They're 2 ahead of us. You say that Jefferson expected these older, wiser men to rewrite the Constitution. I don't know that there's any evidence for that. He just says we need to tear it up and start over.
No, I think, yeah, you're probably right, but I don't think, I have the greatest respect for Jefferson, but I'm willing to say that he and Madison and others would have thought that folks in the room, in the metaphorical or Philadelphia Independence Hall, those in the room ought to be politically experienced, knowledgeable enough that would be thoughtful drafters of a new constitution.
In other words, he had in mind James Madison and people just like James Madison. So, Prairie Gunnels, you would not have been at the Constitutional Convention. It was all men, 55 white men, older men, many of them lawyers, many of them slaveholders, many of them people who had considerable property, and most of whom had participated in some level of governance before, so you represent something the founders could not even have imagined. So tell us about your own involvement in this project.
So I joined the project when essentially Beau came into class one day. I was like, okay, we're going to spend class today using AI. And to me, that was quite honestly surprising and astounding because I've never had a professor, one, even say to use AI outside of class, and two, bring it into the classroom. So it was my first engagement with AI in an academic setting. And so essentially he brought up on the board and the class gave me questions and Beau gave me questions to add in. And I found myself just completely obsessed with it in a sense, where after that, I kept asking more questions and trying to figure out like what it would tell me and what sort of input I could get from it. And then I eventually sent it to Beau and Beau offered to have me join the project.
Thank you for that explanation. So 7 generations, you're going to create a constitution using ChatGPT for each of those 7 living generations. Here's the question for you, Prairie. How do you constitute the founding fathers? So who's at the table? How do you make sure that your computer model for Gen X, for example, has the right people at the table?
Pretty much just fact checking, really. So the base question that we asked is, what would a hypothetical constitution look like if it was based on the values of, let's say, Generation Z? And then it gives me like a summary before it even starts. And in that summary, it says, okay, Generation Z is from this year to this year. And that's typically what I would look for to make sure that I was looking at the right people. And then it would give me a quick summary of what Generation Z focuses on. And for example, for them, it'd be like social justice, it'd be technology, it'd be the environment and things like that. And then that first summary is what I'd look for to basically tell me that the rest of the information is going to be.
When I use ChatGPT, I make an initial request and then I have to refine it. The seldom is my initial request adequate to the cause. So tell us exactly. Let's take one of the generations, whichever one you wish, and walk us through the process.
You're completely correct. I think I asked it maybe 20 questions. It wasn't just one, like, give me a hypothetical constitution. It gave me the hypothetical constitution. And then I asked, what's the ratification process? What's the amendment process? And we focus on certain currently controversial topics. So the two that we focused on were gun rights, and the right to bear arms and the right to freedom of speech. With those refining questions, it became more detailed and more focused. So each of our series is focused on a different topic. And essentially every single one of those questions asks ChatGPT to answer in depth. So it's giving detailed, it gives percentages, it gives numbers for how much people should be taxed and what economic bracket. So the first question is really just to get an overview. And then from that overview, we continue to dive deeper.
So, Prairie, what generation would you identify yourself as being part of?
I would be Generation Z.
Gen Z. Okay,
Yeah.
So can you give us your preamble?
Yes, let me find it.
So,
Gen Z states, we the people of the United States, in order to build a just, equitable, inclusive, and sustainable society for all, establish this Constitution to secure human dignity, protect our planet, guarantee digital and civil liberties, and build a future where every voice is heard and valued.
Okay, so that is, Beau, that is quite different from what Madison and Gouverneur Morris had in mind.
Yeah, for sure. And this is where I think, Prairie's right? There's, I would say, Clay, 80% of it is hit and 20% is miss, or maybe 90% is hit and 10% is miss. And you have to be aware of that. But what's interesting is the way in which, and what Prairie and I are doing is thinking about the evolution of these constitutions. And so you can see it just in the preambles, right? So you go from the Gouverneur Morris preamble to Prairie's preamble, and there all along the way, you can see slight little changes from the greatest generation all the way through to the Gen Z folks. The older generations are not that interested in radical change. They believe in the republic. I wrote an article recently about the difference between a democracy and a republic. There is a difference between a democracy and a republic.
I assume you'll send me your article differentiating republic from democracy. So, Prairie, What I heard in your preamble for your generation was justice in a big capital sort of J way, which the founding fathers didn't really think about in quite the same sense. I heard the planet, the earth. As you read that preamble, Prairie, does it reflect your values? If you had written it without ChatGPT, how it might have been different?
Well, actually, we did do that in Beau's class. We wrote our own constitutions. The biggest difference was that in our preamble, we based it off of the South African one, where it recognized their past to create reparations for our past. We promise. And then a lot of it was just an equitable, inclusive, and we include the environment. We did not include technology in our preamble, but it was included in the later constitution. So I would say, I mean, for ChatGPT, pretty much hit it on the mark.
We need to take a break. Just one quick question for you, Beau. I heard digital. I think you would say beware of things that are going to pass, like digital. We won't be talking about digital 25 years now because it'll just be the way we see the universe. It's important to have evergreen thoughts in a preamble, right?
Yeah, and that's what made Gouverneur Morris's, my all-time favorite founding father. That's what made Gouverneur Morris's preamble so elegant and beautiful, was that he anticipated exactly what you're talking about, Clay. And yes, I think these preambles that Prairie generated do reflect that idea of not legacy and length and endurance over time. And so they're not specific. The one thing I will say I was disappointed about, I know we need to go to break, but I was disappointed about was constitutional preambles have to these days reflect the scars of the past. And for us, it's slavery and the treatment of indigenous folks and the treatment of women, to be honest. These preambles did not reflect that, and that's the one thing that I think was missing.
All right, we're going to take a break. I'm talking to Prairie Gunnels, who is in Italy today, a student of Beau Breslin, and Beau, who is in the United States. I'm in Helena, Montana. Zoom technology, the digital world, has made this conversation possible. When we come back, I want to hear more preambles, and I want to ask both of you to reflect on what you actually learned from this. So when we come back, we'll start there. You're listening to a special edition of our podcast, Listening to America. Stay tuned. Welcome back to this special edition of Listening to America. I'm talking with my old friend Beau Breslin. He's teaching a course on Intro to American Politics. He had his students write new constitutions for the United States, but in a sort of really clever way. Instead of making ChatGPT and AI the bogeyman and the enemy of the classroom, you decided to bring it in and use it for good purposes, Beau.
And to be honest, Clay, I was reluctant to do it. I'm a little bit old-fashioned. I think people ought to read books as in pick up the book and turn the page. I think they ought to write with, maybe not a quill pen, but at least they ought to write. That said, it occurred to me in Prairie's class, in this Intro to American Politics class, that artificial intelligence is not going away. It might, in fact, be the computer of the 21st century. And so we need to embrace it. And I thought, one of the things that's interesting before I turn it back to Prairie, I think a lot, Clay, about Madison in preparing for the Constitutional Convention, right? If you go to Montpelier and you take the tour, they spend a lot of time in his second floor library, and they tell you that he spent months poring over these books and poring over the treatises and histories and so on in order to figure out how to write the Virginia plan, the constitutional draft that he brought to the convention. ChatGPT can do that in 30 seconds. Literally come up with a Virginia plan draft of a constitution in 30 seconds. You didn't need the 6 months that Madison spent. And that's going to revolutionize not just constitution making, but our world as we know it.
Well, that's, Newton, if I saw more than others because I've been standing on the shoulders of giants, ChatGPT can go comb the ideas of Gouverneur Morris and Benjamin Franklin and Abigail Adams and Sojourner Truth and bring them to bear on things. It's a gathering mechanism of extraordinary capacity, which is why it takes so darn much carbon fuel to operate. Prairie, I'm so glad to have you as part of this conversation. You gave us the Gen Z preamble. I'm a boomer. My daughter says the sooner the boomers get off the stage, the better for the world. What is the boomer preamble?
Yeah, so ChatGPT generated and stated that we, the people of the United States, in recognition of our shared history and common future, do hereby establish this Constitution to secure liberty, equality, opportunity, and justice for all, grounded in the belief that progress is built upon the foundation of fairness, compassion, and respect for the individual freedoms. We seek to promote the general welfare and ensure that every citizen has the right to pursue happiness, fulfillment, and prosperity.
Wow, that's very high-minded. And I'm much more jaded because I'm actually part of that generation. If I were writing the preamble, it would be something like, we reserve the right to use up all the resources of the planet without caring really a bit about the future. And if that endangers the very existence of the biosphere, well, that's a price worth having for all the stuff that we get to surround ourselves with. And even though we began as lovers of the age of Aquarius, who were going to bring back kind of an Edenic worldview, we've pretty much been just as sloppy as everyone else in human history. And so we reserve the right to be indifferent to everything that follows us. Is that fair, Beau?
So Clay, you sound like you're the Edmund Randolph of the Committee of Style, the Committee of Detail, where Prairie's got to be the Gouverneur Morris and take what your cynical view and change it into something a little more positive. But it does sound accurate.
It's fun to do this sort of a project. And boy, when you get into ChatGPT, you start just throwing questions at it and you think, wow, this is fascinating. And it seems to be able to know everything. And what a tool. What did you learn from doing this? What is the takeaway for you as a young student of political science?
I think I just took away thinking more critically about our government. I mean, Beau's class also encouraged us to do this, but the amount of creativity, like I know it's generative AI and whatnot, but the amount of creativity it came up with and the different ideas that each generation shows how many possibilities there are. I've learned recently that I'm very American at heart, that I approach things from an American mindset. And looking at these constitutions, they still hold the core values of being an American, but they also are just better in many ways. They represent people better. They're updated to include topics that are present day. They look at it through different aspects. So Generation Alpha creates a new branch in the legislative government.
Wait, explain that. So Alpha is the most the most recent generation is Alpha. And instead of using the old tired Montesquieu tripartite system of government, the executive, the legislative, and the judicial branch, they actually invent a new branch. What's that?
If I remember correctly, I believe the name is House of the People. And essentially, it's supposed to be a bridge between the government and the people. So it takes people's comments and people's concerns and then evaluate it and also look at legislation through making sure that no one's being marginalized and thought against stuff, and that everyone's being included and protected.
I'll just add one more, right? So what Prairie's talking about is the Alpha generation. The Gen Z generation has an equally interesting legislative model, right? Design. And they're replacing, and Clay, you and I have talked about this, they're replacing the largely undemocratic Senate with what they call, this is Gen Z, this is Prairie's generation, what they call the House of Regions. So instead of the politically artificial borders of states being the determinant factor, now it's an equal representation based on regions. So one region might be North Dakota to Idaho, and another region might be a couple of boroughs in New York. But the idea is to have a Senate, an upper chamber, I should say, that's based on regions as opposed to artificial states. Fascinating.
Really interesting. Let me ask one last process question for the moment. If I go to ChatGPT and say, design a constitution for Gen Z, it will do that. If I go there and say, but make sure that every demographic group or ethnic group or gender construction tribe, everybody has to be at the table. In other words, if Beau and I did this just together and we didn't have a Native American present, we would probably ignore Native American concerns. But if a Native American were in that room, she would say, hey, wait a minute. we're not. That's a bad idea. That doesn't work for my world. And so when you have everybody at the table, it gets more messy, more complicated, harder to break through with a compromise. In the process, how do you know that ChatGPT is listening to Mexican Americans, is listening to disabled people, is listening to the LGBTQ community?
So point blank with ChatGPT, you don't know, really. You can see it coming through. You see indigenous tribes being mentioned in different generations, typically the younger generations. So with Generation Z and Generation Alpha, you get indigenous tribes having specific seats in government that are reserved for them so that their voices are heard. You see LGBTQ coming through with protection of people's sexuality and gender expression. You don't know exactly where they're coming from, and I do say that's a limitation, and that's why you don't take ChatGPT and you're like, okay, this is our new constitution. You take it as a base start, because then you can bring everyone to the table. Because let's say like the baby boomers, I think it gives a pretty good understanding of it, but I think we can all agree baby boomers and the silent generation, the greatest generation, I'm making a stereotype, are the least likely to be using the internet, to be on the internet, which makes me think how much of this information is coming from baby boomers and how much of it is other people talking about baby boomers, which is why you can't take something like this and say, this is all correct. You can take it and this is a very good baseline. This is representing many different ideas, but let's get more people to the table and more people from different environments and different regions that normally are not represented, and have a bigger conversation and see what in this generated constitution is lacking, or what is it not reflecting or including.
Yeah, so I'm talking to Prairie Gunnels and Beau Breslin about AI and drafting of new constitutions generation by generation, and I'm learning for the first time that I'm living in a world of 7 generations, not the 1 or 2 or 3 that I thought existed in my little blind world. Let's go to something that you mentioned earlier, Prairie, the Second Amendment, the right to keep and bear arms. Founding fathers had their own reasons for the Second Amendment, I think principally to protect the right to revolution, to make sure that the government did not have a monopoly on the uses of force, to promote a militia system rather than a permanent military establishment. It's Beau, as you know, it's not quite clear what they had in mind, and it's a subject of intense debate. But what we do know is that a high-tech weapon in 1787 was a musket that took about 40 seconds to reload. The Founding Fathers could not have anticipated a 9mm handgun. The Founding Fathers could not have anticipated an AR-15. So, Prairie, as you see the generations moving into the future, what is the attitude or the dynamics you see on the question of the right to keep and bear arms?
There's no generation that outlaws the right to bear arms. Every generation still sees it as a priority, as in some ways it's more of a symbol. It's saying that the people are in charge of this country, that if at any moment the government oversteps, people have the right to defend themselves. And so I think it is a core principle that is kept throughout every generation. However, the more you go through the generations, so the younger generations that are showing up, there's a lot more restrictions and there's a lot more checks that have to go through. And interesting enough, technology gets included. So I think millennials started, but millennials state that every gun has to have what's called like a smart safe lock, which is biometrics. So you either put your finger like on the trigger and it like picks up your fingerprint, or like a face scan or anything like that. And pretty much every generation after that says that if you have a weapon, it has to meet the code of a smart lock, so that no other people who don't have their license and aren't background checked can access it. And then, as one would expect, it also outlaws assault weapons, which is anything that's really seen as a military grade. The example gave was military grade rifles, and then there's increased limitations on rapid fire weapons. But things like pistols and whatnot, you can still get certification for. You just have to have biometric for it, and the process to get a gun is significantly longer as you go both through mental, physical health checks.
It's interesting, Clay, that if you place these side by side, which is what our project is comparing them over the evolution over time. As Prairie said, it is true that the right to bear arms in the constitutions becomes A, more restrictive, never outlawed, 3, it becomes more detailed. So the greatest generation and the silent generation feels a lot like our current Second Amendment. But by the time you get to Gen Z and the Alpha generation, it's a lot more detailed and a lot more restrictive. No generation is going to outlaw the right to bear arms.
But no generation said, why do we need to have 300 million guns in the hands of a citizenry?
No, but I mean, there's a lot of the assault weapon restrictions and regulations and are very real in the later generations.
All right, so, Beau, this is a question for you. If it were an actual constitutional convention with 500 people or 55 people in it, and you said, let's restrict bump stocks and let's make sure that every trigger has a lock system that's and so on. There would be at least 1 and maybe 10 people that would stand up shouting and saying, if you do that, I walk out of here. There will be no constitution. How dare you? This is the most sacred thing in the world. You cannot mess with this. In other words, ChatGPT can't account for the violent opinionation and principle that are important in an event like this and inevitable.
Yeah, so you're exactly right. And I think I'll say a couple things on this topic. One is, that's the beauty of the Prairie's project, right? Is if you make these divisions by generation, if you had a constitutional convention with 55 or 500 Gen Zs, it's going to look a lot different. And you can imagine, Clay, that the 10 people or the 100 people who are standing up and saying, no way are we going to restrict this gun right, those are probably not the 18 to 22-year-olds that Prairie's talking about. They're going to be people like you and me. What we're trying to do in this project is think about open, the curtain a little bit on intergenerational difference when it comes to constitutional understanding. The other thing I'll say about this, which is fascinating, is ratification. Even if you had a constitutional convention that was represented by all these generations and you had the right people at the table, you still have to get ratification. And so what happens when you place these constitutions side by side in terms of ratification is that it becomes increasingly the citizenry over time that has the final say. So later generations, the Alpha and Gen Z generations, want national referenda, voting up and down, don't even need states, legislatures, or state ratifying conventions, will decide whether or not this Constitution becomes authoritative. I think it's fascinating how much small d democracy is reflected in the younger generations, but it's also ratification. I'll also say any constitutional convention, whether it's people like you and me or people like Prairie, it's always going to be essentially a rush to the middle. That is, it's a small c conservative group. If you have 55 or 500 people, there's not going to be the room for radical change. People are worried about constitutional conventions going off the rails, but most people who are rational people, especially if you pick them like you pick jury duty and you have experts in the room, they're gonna stick with what we've got. Where the battles in a constitutional convention today will be is about right. How does the Second Amendment look in a 21st century? Is there a right to privacy? Is there a right to the environmental justice? Is there a right to universal basic income and healthcare and that sort of thing? That's where the debate's going to be. It's not necessarily going to be with structural stuff or what we would say traditional institutional stuff.
Prairie, as you've been speaking, I've been thinking about this. If you put together 55 people to write a new constitution and said, just write the best possible constitution for the United States, just write a great constitution, that would be one thing. If you said, now write one that can get ratified, that's a very different thing, isn't it?
Yeah, no, I would agree. It's a very different thing. Like Beau was saying, there would be a lot more common ground and a lot more compromises that would have to be made. But I think that's also what our country is, in a sense. It's a country of compromises. It's a country of trying to navigate what's the best situation for everyone. Like, how do you create a government that works for everybody in some facet?
Everyone's at the table, but they're just 55 or 500. Then you go to a nation of 340 million people and have the plebiscite that you're talking about, this up or down vote. That's a very volatile thing to do, and the Founding Fathers would be aghast at this idea because they wanted to take the will of the people and distill it and refine it and put it into different boxes to make sure that there wasn't just a spasmodic view of the people without really thinking it through. They wanted to slow things down and make sure that there was compromise and make sure that legislation couldn't simply be rushed through the Congress of the United States. So that's an important element in all of this, I think. Beau.
Clay, I'll do this. I do this every time we're on together. I turn it around and ask you a question. So I'm going to ask you a question because you're as knowledgeable about this stuff as Prairie and I are. So if we're in a constitutional convention and we get the right people at the table, Clay, do we create a constitution that, as Mr. Franklin said, that reflects a republic if we can keep it? Is the 21st century model a small r Republican model? And if not, are we going more towards democracy, in your opinion?
On that note, we need to take a break. I'll think about it during the break and try to answer it when we come back. I'm having a fascinating conversation with Prairie Gunnels and our old friend Beau Breslin about AI, 7 generations, and ChatGPT writing new constitutions for the United States. A brilliant project at Skidmore. We'll be back in just a moment. Welcome back to this special edition of Listening to America. I'm talking with Prairie Gunnels, who's in Italy, student of my friend Beau Breslin, who's in the United States, and I'm way out in the west in Helena, Montana, at the gates of the mountains following the Lewis and Clark Trail. And we're talking about the Constitution of the United States, which is a very timely subject. It's fascinating. So let me go to the question you put at the end of the last segment, Beau, and just give a really preliminary answer, and then I want all of us to think about that. In other words, do we want a republic or not? And so I'm a believer in a small r republic. I think that the vision of the American Republic, as articulated by, say, Thomas Jefferson or James Madison or Thomas Paine or Benjamin Franklin, was one of the great moments in the history of civilization, and that Jefferson in particular thought we could reign in government and the people would remain central, and that might be volatile, but it was essential, and that we don't want to create a system of oligarchy or kleptocracy or aristocracy of any sort, and that we should be particularly concerned about the accumulation of power in any one individual, that the very heart of a republic is to diffuse power through other ways of discerning the will of the people and refining the will of the people. Do I want that? Yes. Of course I want that, but I don't think we're going to get it. I don't think we have it. My view is that we haven't been a republic for a very long time, that we pretend to be a republic. And I'm about to have a conversation in a few months at Vail, Colorado, with Ed Watts, who's an expert on the Roman Republic and its death. And we're going to talk about what happens when a republic dies. And my basic view of this is that we're now a world hegemon. We're now a world power. We are the world power with bases in more than 100 countries, with 751 foreign bases around the world. We police the sea lanes of the world. We are the final arbiter of the world order to the extent that we're willing to assert it. That's not a republic. That's why the Roman Republic died, because a constitution that was made for a city-state was now being applied to an empire, and it just can't work. And that's what Donald Trump says. And I think that Donald Trump's greatest argument is, if China wants to put up a new hospital, it does it in 4 days. If China wants to have new coal-fired power plants or nuclear plants, they license them overnight. That the world is going too fast, it's too volatile, there's too much at stake to have that slow Madisonian deliberative process of governing. We've got to have an executive that can do things, and we're going to do that whether the Constitution allows it or not. And that's essentially been affirmed by the courts and even the American people. So I don't think we're a republic. And if we were creating a new constitution, I'd say don't even try to be a republic unless you plan to split the country up into 7 or 8 different regions. But a 350 million person republic is a contradiction in terms, particularly when you give up the radical isolationism of most of the founding fathers. I mean, Beau, surely you agree with that.
I completely agree with that. And what I would say is this is where Jefferson was spot on, because I would echo exactly, Clay, what you said about the fact that at one time, and the genius of the founding generation, and they deserve credit, right? They don't always get the credit, but they deserve the credit for constructing a political system that was a republic. We're not at that anymore. So the question for us is, how do we get it back? And this is where Jefferson was right. You need to have periodic constitutional reform, periodic constitutional rewrites, periodic constitutional change that reflects it. And I think we could get it back, Clay. Yes, the world is working at a speed that Madison and Franklin and Washington and Hamilton didn't even anticipate. Certainly, Mr. Jefferson didn't anticipate with his agrarian utopia. That said, the pace at which decisions have to be made is real, but I also think you can have legislative branches and judicial branches that counter a presidency if you reform them, right? And if you remove a little bit of politics from, hard to do, from the judicial selection process, you increase the number of legislators so they're not representing huge swaths, you get rid of gerrymandering, maybe term limits and so on. We could go on and on. But I think the time is now to recover the republic, and the way to do that is through constitutional reform. So I'm actually pulling, it's silly, but I'm actually pulling for a 2037, the semi-quincentennial of the constitutional drafting moment, for a new constitutional convention in 2037.
Well, the good news is I'll be dead for a long time by then. So, Prairie, you'll be in charge of the universe. So, as you did this project, Prairie, you learned an awful lot. Of course, you learned more from Beau Breslin's course. But now that you've seen all of this, if you were writing the Constitution yourself and it didn't have to be ratified, what have you learned that you would want to make sure is in the new Constitution?
Interesting question. I mean, there are basic ones that would be expected. The environment, I think, should be included in the Constitution, especially at the state in which the environment is currently. I think protection from marginalized voices that are not heard, not just protections, but some of the constitutions brought up an interesting point of having reserved seats, so seats that are made for groups that are normally not represented. So one of those being the indigenous communities. But I think for that, it's important to have it be an option, where you're not forcing indigenous tribes or nations to take part in politics, but letting their voices be heard if they want to, because we make a lot of decisions for the indigenous community without, we have a history of not actually asking. We have a history of just doing, or have a history of betraying what we say we'll actually do. And so I think including them in the politics so that they have a voice in the US, more so than what they currently have or have ever had. I think also I would honestly be in favor of adding another branch to the government. I think there should be more of a liaison between the people and the government. I think an easy way to do that is technology. I think you can have a technology forum where people are putting input in on amendments that are being proposed, or on different debates that are being talked about, or different, if they're talking about conserving a certain land for a national park, like seeing the people who actually live there, what their thoughts are about it. And then having a branch of government that basically, or even a committee, you could even do a dedicated committee that goes through these information and then presents it to the House and to Congress.
All right, that makes perfect sense to me. I like the idea of a branch, kind of an ombudsman branch, that's listening to the people all the time and just wants to represent them. Not necessarily that becomes determinative in policy, but it has to be always factored in. And I think we all feel that our current system does not really listen to the will of the people very well anymore. Prairie, at what point in that cascade from Greatest Generation down through Z and Alpha, at what point does healthcare make its position known?
If I'm remembering correctly, let me see if I can find it really quick.
I think it's millennials.
Yeah. I also think I thought Generation X also mentioned something about healthcare.
Again, it's interesting because as Prairie's looking it up, it's interesting, Clay, that there does seem to be a divide between the first three, the greatest, the silent, the baby boomer, and the last four. That seems to be where, you draw kind of a line in the sand.
That's why I want young people to do this and not a bunch of wise old people like Mitch McConnell at some sort of an artificial event in Aspen. I don't want them to have any role in this whatsoever unless we choose to consult them. My view is they had their chance and look what they produced. We want fresh ideas. We want people that can look at the Second Amendment with clear eyes, and maybe they still allow the right to keep and bear arms. Sounds like they do. But I don't think that any younger generation would constitute the country in the way that it now exists. Do you, Prairie?
No, I don't think so. Yeah, I think that the younger generations, and I did find that it started with Generation X, that they have a right called the right to work and thrive, which essentially states that people have the right and they have the right to have the option to work and to have healthcare and have education and basic rights given to them so that they are able to have the opportunity to thrive in their society. And I think that if you look towards the younger generations, you'll find that a lot of these things, basic life necessities, are showing up in the younger generations as a given. They're given as something that is necessary for people to be able to survive. You have affordable housing that shows up. I want to say that's either millennials or Generation Z. You have access to technology. So I believe it's millennials who state that everyone should have access to technology. And to my understanding, that would be Wi-Fi, like having some public Wi-Fi that everyone can use. I mean, you'll go, like I went to the beach once and you have to do parking. To pay for your parking place, you have to use a URL code. But what if someone doesn't have a phone? And that we don't live in a society where these things that are now necessary for basic life are given to people. And so some people are at a disadvantage to even park to go to the beach and do simple things like that because of the way that our world has changed. So I think the younger generations, a lot of their rights are basic necessities in order to survive in the current society and world we live in.
I would say that a living wage, for example, has to be central to any new constitution, that every person willing to work and able-bodied should earn a living wage, and that this is a non-negotiable fact of being an equal person in a free society. And yet, Beau, try ratifying that in the current America.
Yeah, the my inspiration and my students, Prairie being one of them, spend a little time at the end of the semester talking about the South African constitutional moment, right, in the early 90s. South Africa did it right, Clay. They did it right. They got the right people at the table. It took a long time, but they came up with a constitutional document that reflects all of these things. Now, admittedly, South Africa doesn't have the infrastructure to deliver on all these things, but the unique nature of the United States and quite frankly, the privileged economic place that we are in allows us to have a constitution that protects a living wage or protects a right to basic housing or protects the right to health care. And that's part of where I'd love for us to go. I'll just say this too. One of the interesting things, one of the genius moments of the founding generation was that when Madison proposes a Bill of Rights, he does it in a negative way. Congress shall make no law abridging freedom of speech. If we were sitting around the table writing a constitution now, we would not use that technique. We would not use the negative technique that he uses in the Bill of Rights. It would be a positive grant of rights. The right to housing, the right to clean air and clean water, the right to health care. These would be promises in a new constitution. That in and of itself represents quite a change from our 1787 document.
Well, that's a fascinating reversal. So we're about out of time. So Prairie, you're having a little holiday in Italy. It sounds wonderful. You and Beau have written some articles jointly and published them. You're an undergraduate, now you're already publishing. So what's your plan? What's your life plan?
Life plan, I don't really have one yet, so to speak of. I love the project. I've gotten a lot out of it just from learning better ways to write. I mean, Beau is a great writer, and I've learned a lot of different techniques on how to make your writing flow just from reading his work. From also learning how to use AI more. I mean, I didn't really use it for academic purposes. I know we don't have time to explain it, but AI is negatively viewed in the academic world and you get in trouble for it. It's considered plagiarism. I have a personal belief that if you use it correctly, it shouldn't be considered plagiarism, and it's actually one of the most useful tools out there if it's used correctly, not just copied and paste. But I've also learned, about the different generations. It's helped me have more empathy for different generations and understanding where people that I know that are in older generations, where they're coming from and where people that are around me are coming from. And I've just gotten a lot out of it. I'm not planning to do political science in the future, but it's something that's really important to me. I'm planning to go into social work, which I think is just political science, but in a different way, really. It's just applying politics by working with people and supporting people.
Beau, just a couple of little exit things. One is, Prairie said, if you use it correctly, if you use it in the right way, it can really lead to these results. But if you choose to use it in the wrong way, you have to face AI every day now as a college professor. And when she was saying that, I wanted to quote Madison, if men were angels, no government would be necessary. If humans were angels, we wouldn't have to police AI, but humans aren't angels. There's a kid in a dorm who partied too much over the weekend. He has an essay due. He goes right to AI, pulls it out, changes 6 words here and there, turns it in. You don't have time to track that down. It's not in your interest to be a policeman of AI plagiarism. And we're talking about a very, very complex system, and human nature will out, right?
Yeah, and that's why you're the best host on the radio these days, is because you can you can apply Madison's Federalist 51 to artificial intelligence. I'm not sure too many people do that, but yes. So this is fascinating, right? And I'll say this: so I could take, as a faculty member, we have software, Turnitin software, that I could take all of Prairie and her students, throw it through, and it would give me a percentage assessment of how much was generated by AI. We did a very informal study here at Skidmore where we took a class of 2016, Clay. This is before AI is on the planet. 2016, a group of papers, and threw them through a contemporary Turnitin type software program, and it still suggested that the 2016 papers were generating by a significant amount of artificial intelligence. So I'm not sure there's any way that faculty in this day and age can really police what's going on. So I'm choosing to embrace it as opposed to resist it.
I like that. Just 2 very quick answers, please, Beau. Number 1, in all of this conversation, I have not heard the word responsibilities. Lots of rights and a lot of we should have access to this and that, but how are you going to pay for it, and what are our responsibilities as citizens, and how do we give back? If Jack Kennedy said today, ask not what your country can do for you, but what you can do for your country, he'd be hooted off the stage of the Capitol of the United States. So how do we address that issue is a question for you, Mike.
As far as responsibilities are concerned, Clay, it's super interesting because obviously the earlier generations, the greatest and the silent generation, and even the baby boomers, speak of it in their preambles, speak of responsibilities and duties and self-sacrifice and so on. And that goes away, that evaporates in the later generations. And I think one of the things that maybe someday we can talk about is the idea of radical individualism as being a late 20th century or 21st century. At some point, people were enticed by the Marlboro Man out west on being the radical individual. Do not bother me. Robert Putnam obviously has a great book, Bowling Alone, on this exact topic. Individualism has replaced the idea of community sacrifice, the idea that Jefferson was talking about in his last sentence of the Declaration of Independence, and so on. Individualism is now the dominant force in American theoretical life. And I think that's reflected in the lack of responsibility in these constitutions in later generations.
We're going to have to leave it there. I'm so sorry, but I am so appreciative of Prairie Gunnels coming in from Italy today, Beau Breslin from Skidmore. I'm in Helena, Montana. We're having a lively conversation. I only will make this suggestion to the two of you, that you should create a learned article about this that can appear in the Wall Street Journal or the Atlantic, because I think that the country desperately needs to think about these things. I don't think we're going to have a new constitutional convention. I don't think we're even going to have a proper modeling of what that would look like by way of a non-binding academic or social event. But I think getting your ideas from this course and this exercise on the table in our national conversation would be a first-rate thing to do. To all of you, we'll see you next week for another important edition of Listening to America.